panel on the science of Doctor Strange. It's a great movie, guys. I got to pull some strings and saw it. I won't spoil you. I don't want to be mobbed afterwards. In order to introduce our awesome panelists, I'm going to go down the line and just have them say their name and talk about their area of expertise before we get into it.
I'm Jon Spaihts, and I was one of the writers on the film, along with the director Scott Derrickson and his writing partner Robert Cargill.
My name is Stephen Broussard. I work for Marvel Studios, and I was one of the executive producers on this film.
My name is Bolu Ajiboye. I'm a research professor at Case Western Reserve University, and I work with people, Cleveland, and I work with people who have severe paralysis and design technology to help them be able to move again.
My name is Luis Garza. I'm an MD PhD. I see patients and I run a molecular biology lab, and we study regenerative medicine.
So my name is Adam Frank. I run a computational research group, astrophysics, at the University of Rochester. We study how stars and planets form, and we've also been doing a lot of work on astrobiology, thinking about advanced life on other planets.
All right. This is a hot panel, you guys. So my first question will be towards Stephen and Jon. Can you talk a little bit about when did the development process, did science and the research into science play as the movie came to be?
It sort of goes back to the comics, you know, even in the earliest incarnations, magic in this world, in this character's life, is not sort of a boiling cauldron, Eye of Newt magic, you know, that we've seen done very well in other types of stories. It goes back to the idea of other dimensions and the idea that there's all this stuff that maybe just exists outside our own perception. And if you have the right set of skills, perhaps you can tap into that and use it for to do some pretty cool things. And, you know, it was Jon and myself and Scott sitting around, and Kevin Feige sitting around, batting around the story, trying to figure it out. And Scott was sending us articles by his friend Adam, and we would read them, and they were really fascinating. And then after a certain amount of time happened, we said, let's get Adam on a plane out here to just talk about this stuff in person. And that sort of spun out into some awesome freewheeling conversations that could have been in some dorm room somewhere about the mind and the nature of consciousness, man, and sort of was like sincerely like some of the most fun I think we had in those rooms. And it sort of spun out from there, and it was the idea to embrace what magic was, but to always leave magic as magic.
And Jon, when in writing it's kind of sometimes hard to get bogged down into details and be kind of, especially you're creating a magical world, you're being it's almost like the science could weigh you down, but did you find that all those details freed you as a writer?
It's, for me, important not to get bogged down in rules. I think there are profundities that feel true to us. And if you can build magic on top of those profundities, then an audience will go with you. And you don't need to teach them elaborate rule sets or make up a pseudoscience. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has a great relationship with science. It cares deeply about technology and about science, but it indulges in fancy in the execution of that and the expansion of it into the superhuman. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted our feet in a notion of many universes, in the idea that behind our reality there's another reality and another and another, and that each of them might contain different physical laws, fundamentally different physical processes, and that magic might to some extent be a process of reaching into other universes and drawing upon other physical laws at will, kind of cheating the rule book without breaking the rules.
Yeah, when just in watching it, I was struck by the egg layers, as you taught. You could definitely see the layers of thought you guys put behind it, and it really, it made it, I think, a really special movie. Moving on to our science panel, this movie, Doctor Strange, is a lot about science that we don't know yet. It's particularly in the area of human consciousness. I mean, it's pretty fascinating that each one of us can eat an apple, and when we chew it, it's going to activate the same parts of our brain, but where our experience of that apple bite is going to be totally different. Can you guys talk briefly about why that is on a fundamental level? Why do we have relative consciousness even though we have the same physicality, in a sense, in our brain?
Well, I think, this is, as I was saying in my talk, about the philosophy. We don't really know why. I mean, there'll be different arguments about that. But there is a strong argument going on for physicists, for neuroscientists, for philosophers, about what exactly this vividness, the word they often use is qualia. The qualia, the sense of blueness that you have, that's not mine. And that's what I think is really remarkable about the movie and about the idea is that we don't really know what consciousness is. David Chalmers, when he proposed the hard problem, one of his suggestions was like, you know what, maybe we need to add something new to the universe more than atoms. Maybe bare awareness is like charge or mass. So, I mean, for me, I'm a lapsed reductionist. I used to be a reductionist, but as I've gotten older, I've kind of, lost that. And I think there's more. Exactly how you fit that more into science is the really interesting question. There's a science out there waiting to happen. But I think right now we don't know. At least that's my point.
Yeah, I think there's a couple examples that come to me as a physician of this question. And I think fundamentally it is the power of the mind. So the first one is the placebo effect. So for the scientific method, whenever we do a trial on people to see if a drug works, we have the drug, and then we have a comparison group where there isn't the drug, and we call the placebo group. But what we've discovered in the last, 5 or 10 years pretty quickly is that even that a drug might be better than the placebo in cases where it works. But in a lot of cases, the placebo itself does something to disease. So the question there is when somebody thinks they're taking a medicine, their condition improves. So I think that's one example of how I think the mind has powers that, we can't even really fully understand. Another one is hospice. So, like, let's say, you have a sick grandmother or grandfather that might be terminally ill. Sometimes they place them into a part of the hospital called a hospice where they withdraw treatment. Some people actually found that the survival rates are higher in hospice for some diseases. So when you withdraw normal treatments, because people are in a happy environment with their family, their disease improves. So I think there's a lot of examples in medicine of how the mind has really powerful effects on the body, and that might come some close to your question.
I think one of the great things about Doctor Strange's origin story, for that reason, is the place where he begins. Because he is a neurosurgeon, and he has an expertise which lies at the intersection of a vast abstract knowledge of anatomy and the workings of the brain and the nervous system, and also the fine motor control of an athlete. He is essentially an artisan at the same time. And he might be the last cry of those neurosurgeons, because robot surgery is probably coming, and there will be a day when that junction of expertise no longer exists. But in losing his hands, his instrument, he loses the ability to apply his knowledge, and he goes seeking. It's the thing that ultimately begins to open his mind. And the fact is that there is a vast mystery lying at the heart of how we actually control our bodies, how mind and body are knit together. There's much that's unknown. And in episodes of paralysis, of crippling, of remission of those conditions, there is, to this day, a great deal we don't know.
Yeah, for sure. It's the Cartesian duality, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. And we know we have this brain, but we also have this physicality. And so, yeah, his character is a great example of his having a very physical art, but at the same time he learns in the end that his mind is really more important.
And that's an interesting segue into another area of science that this movie really talks about, the nerve damage. There's a lot of, I'm sure you guys can talk about in science that are enabling people with severe nerve damage, like Dr. Strange and even much more extreme conditions, in order to be able to gain function in very inventive ways. Can you guys talk about that?
Sure. So maybe I'll add to your question. Say, so for somebody who's been in a traumatic car accident and has had like a severe spinal cord injury, what are options for them to be able to regain integration back into society? Well, we do that at least two ways. We use two different technologies. The first is called functional electrical stimulation. So it's basically implantable devices going to be implanted into paralyzed muscles that can apply electrical current to paralyzed muscles and cause them to contract. So much like pacemaker technology, you can stimulate sets of paralyzed muscles and cause people with paralysis to be able to stand up, to be able to reach out and grasp objects. So now this technology has actually been around for 30 plus years. The second technology that we use, that we integrate with functional electrical stimulation, is our brain-machine interface. So we have the ability now to actually record from single neurons in the brain, high resolution, to be able to understand how movement is encoded in the brain. So we actually implant electrodes inside the brain, record neural activity, and then we essentially decode what the person is thinking. So whether or not they want to open and close their hand, whether or not they want to extend and flex their elbow. And we can then tie these two technologies together, brain-machine interfaces, functional electrical stimulation, and essentially circumvent the traumatic spinal cord injury to be able to give people with chronic paralysis the ability to, again, reach out and grasp objects.
Wow. And as a doctor, like, what are the things that you're doing in order to be able to allow people with this kind of severe nerve damage to, I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah, we're in some overlapping groups. We were joking, like, just like Tony Stark, we're both funded by the Department of Defense to try to, in this case, help wounded warriors. And the furthest extension of the technology you just heard about, they call the Luke Skywalker arm that DARPA developed. So it's like a mechanized arm that has direct neural inputs to control it. And it actually, it's being tested right now. It's actually working in people. The other effort that the Armed Forces Institute of Regenerative Medicine that I'm a part of was working on is saying, okay, let's say you have a nerve resection, like you're in a blast injury, you've lost your arm. They try to reattach your arm, but there's some areas where the nerves are separated. They're trying to lengthen the distance between two severed nerves where they can create a synthetic conduit through polymers and biomaterials to try to allow those nerves to connect again. So, and again, it's like really dramatic how science and science fiction aren't that far away.
Readers of the comics will know that Dr. Strange spends a lot of time out of his body. And leaving his body in spiritual form is one of the ways he has adventures. There are whole comic books where he barely is corporeal the entire time. He moves in spirit throughout the story. And that always makes me think about phantom limbs, which are to some extent the closest real experience we have with the sense of being a spiritual body independent of our physical body. And we often hear about phantom limbs as a source of discomfort or suffering because a person who has lost a limb may still feel itching or clenched muscles or other discomfort in a limb that's not there anymore. And there's some fascinating ways of treating that. But I was also fascinated to hear that in the use of prosthesis, amputees actually find their phantom limbs necessary, that until their phantom limb sort of shoots out and inhabits the prosthesis, they cannot comfortably use it. And I wonder to what extent that touches on your research.
Yeah, so that's very true. So what you're speaking about is this concept of embodiment. So we actually are able to use our hands and use our arms well because we feel like they are a part of us. As opposed to a tool, grabbing a hammer. The hammer doesn't feel like it's a part of us. Until we begin to embody that device, when we begin to embody that device, use of it is more natural. Actually, people have done studies to show that representation, cortical representation, so representations in the brain of different body parts change depending on how much we embody them. So when you begin to embody a device or embody a prosthesis, that device actually gets represented cortically.
It almost makes you want to, I mean, I know this is just spurious, but you could literally go to a place and then control an avatar with your body and have them fight. I'm a gamer. So, of course, that's what I'm thinking about. Anyway, Stephen, you had a comment?
No, I was just going to build on what you were saying about how the distance between science and science fiction is collapsing. It seems at a rapid rate. And that was one of the reasons why in our earlier conversations we were just like, how far out can we go with Strange? How can we go full weird, as Scott used to say? Because it does sort of feel like Iron Man came out 8 years ago, and it already feels like some of the technology you're talking about, it's catching up with it. And it has a long way to go, obviously, before that. But it's amazing to watch the envelope shrink.
I'd love to talk a little bit about multiverse because as you see, there's a lot of talk about different dimensions and multiverses, and there are, I mean, you read articles every day where a lot of very reliable, reputable people believe there are parallel universes that we're all living in. And I guess my question is, how much does that mess with your mind in creating it? Because honestly, it's kind of like time travel in a way. Like it could get kind of crazy and hard to simplify for an audience in an hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever. But also, how do we even prove that that's real? Is there even a way? So maybe you guys can talk to the creative, and then we can talk a little science.
The fact that cosmologists will sit together around a table and solemnly agree that the universe is 10-dimensional and the bulk is like this, and I agree, I think that's correct. That lines up with mine. I have no idea. That's astounding to me. And then beyond that, the notion that behind our universe are very likely other universes, some like ours, some unimaginably different, that the things that we call cosmological constants, values like pi and the force of gravitation, could be arbitrary values. In another universe, you weigh something different and circles work differently and straight lines don't behave like we think straight lines behave. That's terrifying, bewildering, but it's also really promising if you're a storyteller.
It makes some good set pieces, guys, believe me.
If you know how to open that door, deformed realities may be available to you. You may be able to benefit from other physics and to make the impossible happen without actually violating the laws of physics because you're using a different rule set. You swapped it in.
Actually, so I'm going to pour a little cold water on this because, as a science, I've written a lot on this, and I actually think, and this is actually an interesting inversion, because we talk about the distance between science and science fiction. My argument against string theory and the multiverse, first of all, they're beautiful ideas, and they're awesome, fun, and there's been a lot of mathematics done around it, but as a physical theory, I think they're wrong. And one of the problems is that what has happened in my field is that there's been too much science fiction, right? Because these ideas are so exciting as science fiction, and a lot of us are science fiction fans, there's a way in which people started creating mathematics and then believed the mathematics. So, there's absolutely right that many cosmologists are talking about this, but there's a war, not a war, that's too much, but there's a lot of fierce argumentation about whether the multiverse is actually too much science fiction for science. And here's an actually interesting idea that somewhere there's a book or a movie to be made. The pushback now is that there's only one universe. There's only one universe. And that is a problem, because exactly as you say, we live in a universe that seems absolutely fine-tuned for life. If you take any of the physical constants and change them by 1 in a bazillion, life can't be possible. If gravity's just a little bit stronger, stars burn out too fast. If electromagnetism's a little bit too weaker, you'll never get biomolecules. So if the universe is a one-time story, and there's only one of them, then how do you make sense of that? And this is the great challenge in science right now. So I think the multiverse is a beautiful, interesting idea. There's no data to support it. That's why, as a scientific idea, there's no data to support it. Zero. Zilch. Not at all. Okay? But for a narrative device, it's the best.
One fun thing to realize, though, is that I think all scientists and biologists would agree about is that our sense of reality is completely skewed. So, like, we were talking about this earlier tonight, if you think about your sense of touch, your sense of smell, your eyesight, all those work at rapidly different rates, and yet our brain kind of has to make them coherent and internalize them, and all of that takes milliseconds. So actually, the life you're experiencing right now is all in the past. And your body, your brain is trying to push forward to pretend like it's in the present. Because it takes time for your brain to process all of these inputs. So you're fundamentally living in the past, first of all. Second of all, we commonly really rely mostly on our eyesight. But if you think about the wavelengths of visible light, that is a fraction of the wavelengths of energy that are all around us. So the reality we think we inhabit is a tiny sliver of the real reality all around us. So I think that's something all scientists would agree on.
It's kind of another kind of multiverse, like right in front of us in some sense, yeah.
Which you hate too.
No, that is real.
Okay,
right?
fine. Oh, okay, gotcha. We are running out of time, unfortunately. I do want to throw one thing, because I really love the way that you guys in this movie deal with someone who's very scientific based, being confronted with things that are the unknown. And there's some interesting things in it about, you would say, mysticism, like meditation, chakra, things that are beyond, and there's, you can see it almost in the zeitgeist of the world right now. There's a big resurgence and things like that. And, most people would say there's no science in all of that. But I think that there are increasingly proven that there is science behind it. Do you want to guys talk about a little bit about that, and how you guys kind of reconciled the movie and those two things, and then maybe you guys can talk about cutting edge research that maybe justify some of that movie grooviness.
Sure. I mean, the movie's about a guy who has his identity taken away, and he knows everything. He's at the top of his game. And perhaps, one of the reasons I love that we're doing an event like this with our first movie about magic is it's kind of in the DNA of his journey to realize that he maybe through his hubris, he had stopped questioning things. He had stopped taking, he took it for granted that he knew everything, right? And when the life he knows is taken away from him, he sort of has to go back and he has to question everything. And it's all on the table for him, It's born out of a moment of desperation, but then he sort of starts to put it all together again. And so we approach it like that, from a character's sort of perspective of a guy who has to build himself back up.
At the beginning, his skills as a student, the things that made him the world's best neurosurgeon, do carry him forward. He memorizes well, he reads well, he connects dots, but there comes a point of diminishing returns beyond which he cannot pass by raw intellect and rationality alone. And he is obliged to accept the possibility that he's not going to understand all this intellectually, that he's going to have to make a leap of faith and allow the unknown to be mysterious and believe in it anyway. And watching him hit that point, I think, is fascinating.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about placebo. Can you guys talk about the science behind some of these phenomena that maybe justify it in a scientific way, but it was only belief before?
Well, sure. So the one thing I'll say is that I don't believe that there seems to be this weird tension between science and religion, or science and spirituality. I don't think that tension needs to exist, and I think Adam would agree that there can be manifestations of spirituality or a scientific basis for manifestations of spirituality. So, for example, people have done fMRI research, so like scanning the brain while people are having visions, if you will, and it gets manifested as seizure-like activity in the temporal lobe. Now that doesn't negate the authenticity of that experience, but it does have manifestations in the cortical representations of the brain. So these can both exist. One doesn't negate the other, and I think they can live in harmony.
I'll just quickly say, like, this idea about the negative space. So you can imagine like a Japanese rock sculpture or something, and it has a beautiful kind of substantiality to it. But the really fun question also to ask yourself is, what about the negative space? What are the areas that aren't occupied in that? And I think in medicine they're very good at asking what's occupied. But what really excites scientists and like creative people are, well, what's the negative space? So I think that's a fun thing where science and literature can kind of, and movies can kind of come together about interpreting the sculpture.
Just to finish, I think you guys did such a beautiful job of the representation of that journey. It's about a person's journey, and at some point, science, it's not about explanations, right? Our lives are about more than explanations. You don't corral human experience with explanations, and that's so much Dr. Strange's journey. So, meditation, there's all this science now about people's effects of meditation, and I think that's really an interesting place.
And I know it was deeply important to our director, Scott Derrickson, that we not reduce the mysterious and the unknown by explaining it.
Yeah.
That is one thing to give a footing whereon the inexplicable might stand, to sort of wave at a few things that might be involved. But it's important to allow the mystical experience its cloak of mystery.
Well, I think you guys did an amazing job in grounding the magic in a concrete way without taking the magic away.
Right.
So I wish I could ask a lot more questions, but our time is up. So thank you guys for your time. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much.